Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and taking the time to join us. I'm Jordana Jarrett, editor here at the Webby Awards, and thank you for joining us for the last Unpacked event, Essentials for an Inclusive Internet. So in January, we launched this virtual event series as part of a long-term partnership with the NAACP. It's a three-part series, and in each session, we're bringing together thought leaders, creators, and scholars to explore issues impacting Black communities online. And our goal is to unpack these issues and provide both insights and action steps we can take into our lives to become better allies and build a more equitable internet. So today for our last session, we're going to be exploring algorithmic bias in tech and how it impacts Black folks in a few different ways. So if you're not familiar with the term, algorithmic bias is a term to describe systematic and inequality perpetuating errors that exist in predictive technologies. They generate outcomes that typically favor one group or another and can harm communities that are already at risk for facing discrimination. And unfortunately, this type of bias is becoming more common as companies and institutions turn to predictive technologies to inform their decision making. Just to put some of it into context, police departments across the US have been experimenting with predictive policing to analyze crime data and decide where to deploy officers and which individuals are more likely to commit a crime. So, based on existing crime data and policing practices, Black neighborhoods and individuals are often selected, which further justifies the over policing of Black communities and the prevalence of Black folks in the criminal justice system. This is just one way that it impacts folks. It's definitely an insidious issue that shows up in many different ways. It's a complex issue, and it can create a really vicious cycle that compounds discrimination that Black folks face on a daily basis. Yet the data collection processes that make this all possible are pretty normalized. So today we're talking about what can be done about this. And today I'm joined by two amazing panelists for our conversation. Danielle Davis, who is the founder of AI Policy for Black Women and also serves as policy counsel for a leading tech and telecom nonprofit in DC. And Wisdom Cole, the director of the NAACP's Youth and College Division. So before we start, I'll just preface by saying there will be a chance for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, and we'll circle back to them. Danielle and Wisdom, thank you so much for being here. Before we get into it, I was just wondering if you could introduce yourselves and a bit about the work that you do. Danielle, if you could go first.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Davis, and I am an attorney living and working in Washington, D.C., and also the founder of AI Policy for Black Women, which is an organization dedicated to bringing to light the harms that especially affect Black women in regards to algorithmic technologies. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you. And Wisdom?
Amazing. It's so great to be here with some amazing folks. My name is Wisdom Cole. I am the National Director for the NAACP Youth and College Division. I've been working with the NAACP for about 4 years now. And really within my role, I work to build Black local power with young Black people across the nation. We have 800 NAACP chapters who are constantly training, mobilizing, and winning local victories to make sure that we are informing national narratives that can impact the outcome of the election. And so I'm super excited to be here with you all and have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, let's just get into it. Algorithmic bias shows up in technology in many ways. So I wanted to start broadly. Danielle, as policy counsel for a leading tech nonprofit, what are some of the most significant ways you've seen Black communities impacted by bias in tech and across platforms?
Thank you, Jordana. Thank you again for having me, and thank you to the NAACP and the Webbies for hosting this timely event on this very important issue that impacts our community in such profound ways. But that's a great question. There are many ways in which bias in technology has impacted the Black community, but some of the most significant ways that I want to discuss with you today are the ones that affect our liberty, our freedom of expression, our constitutional rights, and also the opportunities that are available to us or not available to us. bias. So for instance, algorithmic bias, you just gave a great definition of that. And algorithmic bias can affect Black communities' experiences in regard to every aspect of our lives. So we have the criminal justice system, as you mentioned. We have employment. We have trying to secure housing. We have trying to get approved for loans, violations of our constitutional rights, online privacy issues, as well as online freedom of expression issues on online social media platforms. So I just said a whole lot, right? But how does this even show up? Like, what does this mean? So algorithmic bias can show up in the form of, let's just give some examples. Facial recognition technology misidentifying a man that then results in him being arrested in front of his children, um, losing his job, and also just the sheer public humiliation of being arrested for something that you just did not do. So that's in that bucket of when I just talked about things that affect the freedom, your ability to move, your liberty. So along with that also can go predictive risk algorithms. So essentially these are increasingly common around courtrooms across the nation. So we have these assessments that are used essentially to inform decisions about who can be set free at every stage of the criminal justice system, from assigning bond amounts to even more fundamental decisions about the defendant's freedom. So that's, with those two, we can talk about how it affects our liberty, our ability to move, our freedom. And then we can go into freedom of expression on online platforms. So despite measures taken by we're going to just say a large social media company, who shall name nameless. They basically were trying to have a way of being more proactive of monitoring harmful posts. But in actuality, what happens is that the deleted content, the content that they said they were trying to monitor hate speech with, they were actually directed towards the Black community, which means frequently Black women's comments that spoke out against racism or sexism were removed for what the company says was violating their own hate speech policies. So furthermore, we have Black female politicians and journalists that have been disproportionately targeted with abusive or problematic posts, and they go largely unaddressed by the platform. So we essentially have this situation where Black people can't express the harms that have been done to them on social media platforms out of fear of being removed. But then you also have the platform that is not necessarily taking the necessary steps to protect the group from the harms that they claim that these policies are trying to protect in the first place. So there's a lot of ways that algorithmic bias shows up in the real world. But I think it's most important that Black people, that we're informed in the ways that have the most significant impact on our freedom, our constitutional rights, and the opportunities to advance in this country.
Thank you. Well said. And Wisdom, in your work at the NAACP and, in your background with STEM, I'm just wondering, have you seen racism and technology impact young Black people, and in which ways?
Yeah, I agree with all the examples that Danielle said, and I may name some names. I'm still thinking about it. But, as a former educator, I'm also thinking about people's access, to education. And so recognizing, COVID-19 shifted everything. We went from, thinking we were going to have an amazing year. I remember I was in Paris in 2020, it's going to be my year, it's going to be great, it's going to be dope, and not knowing what was in store for us. And so recognizing that, when this pandemic hit, access to technology, to healthcare, to the resources necessary for folks to be successful in this country was limited, right? We're thinking about, for our young people, internet and computer, right? Oftentimes we used to rent out computers to our young people when I used to be a teacher, and recognizing that in certain cities, access was limited. I think it really shined a light on the fact that we are not actually addressing this problem in our day-to-day. And so I'm glad that came up to be, but I'm super sad that people suffered and didn't have access to speak with their teachers, engage in their studies, engage in their course material. That is going to be a big limiting factor, especially as we're thinking about the next generation, right? I'm constantly thinking about the mental health impacts for young people and the different gaps that people have, right? We oftentimes talk about the slide that happens during the summertime, right? After you're not in school for a certain period of time. When you haven't been in school, when you're doing school virtually, you don't have access to the internet, access to a computer, a lot of things are being missed. And so a lot of people are behind, and a lot of people are not going to be at the place that they need to be. But for some reason, we continue moving on and not stopping and saying, hey, let's address this issue.
Thank you. Thank you. And so, just also when thinking about tech bias, I was thinking in a couple of ways that I've seen it show up. And so I think one pattern that's that's revealed or is the result of algorithmic bias is the erasure of Black people. So, I mean, y'all can definitely speak to it better than I can, but I was just thinking as an example, an AI exam proctor not being able to identify that a Black student is at her computer, and what happens, when that kind of error occurs. And so I was wondering, Wisdom, if you could take this first. You've spoken on how, lack of access to technology impacted a lot of students during COVID. But I'm also wondering if you've seen how, this kind of algorithmic bias has also resulted in like the erasure of young people in certain spaces, whether on social media, et cetera.
Yeah. So, again, like COVID really highlighted a lot of things. Folks were watching more than ever. Our social media engagement went up tenfold. Folks were engaging in all the new social media platforms. We have TikTok, we have Clubhouse, we got Instagram, we got Snapchat. We have all these ways in which we are engaging and having opportunities to have these necessary conversations, right? After the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, after the murder of George Floyd, after the murder of Breonna Taylor, young people were talking about this and wanting to get answers and wanting to have dialogue, but also wanting to inform their peers on how they can be active and engaged. And folks realizing that, them using their Black creative voice to talk about these issues and advocate for these issues, that they were suddenly being silenced, and that for some reason that they couldn't actually get their messages out, that there were so many restrictions, things that didn't allow them to post their content, things that didn't allow people to get the engagement that they wanted to see. There was confusion, right? Folks talking about, let's post a Black square to show solidarity for Black Lives Matter, but then that also blocking out information for folks that's necessary to get engaged. And so, we're seeing it coming from every single angle, recognizing that it's very important for us to know who are our trusted brands, who are our trusted allies, who are the people who support us, to make sure messages hit the people that we want to see encompassed it. And so I think it's very important for us to think about our positions on these platforms and where our dollars and cents are going toward it.
Thank you. And Danielle, similarly, I was wondering how you've also seen, algorithmic bias result in the erasure of Black folks in digital spaces or offline. And if you could also speak to kind of what are the sources that are contributing to this problem, that would be amazing.
Okay, so one prime example could be facial recognition technology, where essentially the technology does not accurately recognize Black faces, specifically darker skinned women. You just mentioned an example that kind of hints to those issues right there, where the proctor didn't necessarily recognize the Black student. But for a general overview, like on this subject, I definitely suggest our audience look at this movie called Decoded Bias. And essentially it's based off of the research of MIT then researcher, she's now a PhD, Joy Balamwini, where it just basically follows her discovery of this issue, where she realized that the facial recognition technology would not recognize her bare face. So when she was in front of it, it would recognize her colleagues, her classmates, but her face, no glasses, no nothing, it wouldn't recognize it until she put a white mask. It wouldn't recognize it. So just a plain white mask was enough for the technology to then be able to put the facial it was able to recognize some features, not her actual Black features, but the features of this mask. So, and also through her research, it was revealed that some of the world's most recognizable Black women were not being recognized by the facial recognition technology. So, for example, I don't know where in the world Serena Williams can go and not be recognized. Oprah Winfrey or Michelle Obama can go and not be recognized, but we have real issues with the facial recognition technology where it cannot recognize the three most recognizable women on the face of the planet. So this becomes an issue when you think about it, because if it can't recognize those women, and what does it mean for the rest of us who don't have the fame, the fortune, the access to get out of these situations when they do go downhill, essentially? Like, what does that mean? But outside of just the facial recognition technology, because I could stay there all day, but another way we've seen the erasure of Black people is on online platforms. I mentioned how, speaking about racism and the Black women and how what Black women face on these platforms, and how it's often resulted in their posts ironically being flagged for hate speech. This becomes an issue because when we think of who are some of our most prominent modern day social justice leaders in this movement are, and how they go about the business that they conduct. They use social media. Social media is it's the way we get our speech out. It's being moderated harshly when it comes to Black people, but it's pretty much our mechanism for getting our calling out wrongs, bringing injustices to light. George Floyd was a product of social media. When we think about Trayvon Martin as well, that was a product of social media getting behind that. So basically, as we've seen, is that our our digital spaces and our real world experiences are kind of just starting to mesh together. And if we don't have an adequate way to get out these wrongs and say what needs to be said, we're in for a hell of a ride, especially when we're talking about going into other more advanced, I shall say, platforms such as the metaverse and what that's going to mean. But we could talk about that one like all day, but that's the answer to the question.
Mm. And I was just thinking about the documentary that you're talking about, and I feel like another issue is where data is coming from, or how it's being put together, who's putting it together, and even when we're thinking of what data sets people are using for to inform facial recognition. I feel like it's not an obvious answer, but it's like, or for me, I'm like, okay, where is this data coming from? Like, who's sourcing it? Who's putting it together? Um, yeah. So I don't know, Danielle, if you could maybe speak to where that's going wrong and how people are pulling this together.
So absolutely. So I'm going to speak carefully because I don't want to confuse or speak
Yeah, for
inaccurately
sure.
of this subject. But yes, part of the issue is that algorithms themselves are a black box in which we kind of just don't know exactly what they're thinking, aside from like the data it contains, or even like entirely what they're capable of. But that's besides the point. So to answer your question is going to require us to dive a little bit into a little bit of computer science and explain just an algorithm, because the problem by itself, and I just want to be clear before I go into this explanation, is not necessarily where the data is coming from, even though I'm going to speak loosely on that because that can be issues too. But for purposes of this question, it's the quality of the data that's often the issue. So if we just get down to the basics of an algorithm, they power, for purpose of the conversation, they power AI. They power all of the technology and the apps that we love and we use every day. So algorithms are sets of step-by-step instructions, essentially, and it tells a computer what to do. So a recipe, if we think about a recipe to bake a cake, that is an algorithm because you're going by a set instruction of a procedure that's going to lead you to a certain outcome or a certain result. So there's algorithms that can do set by set instructions, and then there's algorithms that can learn on their own. Um, And for example, so we're going to put on right now our computer scientist hats, or our we're going to be coders, we're going to be doing all this stuff. So basically, for example, pretend you want to write an algorithm that tells the search engine how to identify pencils. So you're going to feed the algorithm data. And that data is going to be millions of photos of correctly labeled pencils. So there's going to be all types of pencils, tall pencils, short pencils, red, pink, all types of pencils. So it can have, so anytime it tries to identify a pencil, it knows exactly what it's looking at, correct? So the algorithm can then detect other pictures of pencils by comparing it to a set of attributes or characteristics that it's learned from the data, the millions of pictures that you fed it. So do you get where I'm going? But at the end of the day, an algorithm is only as good as the data it learns from. So if the data is trash, the algorithm is not going to be much better. So the more data an algorithm is trained on, the more accurate the results will be. But if there's not enough data, the algorithm will have blind spots or these, biases. So that leads people to ask these questions about, like, well, how can this be, and why is this happening? And the answer can be very, very simple for purposes of this conversation, and that's because there's nothing really artificial about artificial intelligence, because behind every algorithm there's a person's set of values, their cultural intelligence, that will all influence what the data the algorithm is trained on and how that computer is going to learn. So to not name another company, let's just say a certain tech company has teaches its facial recognition technology software to recognize human faces, but it only uses the pale male data set that Joy Balamwini mentions in her coded bias. If they only use, for the most part, white male faces, wouldn't it make sense if the software tried to identify me and it couldn't? Like, it wouldn't be able to do it because the data set didn't include enough Black female faces. The machine couldn't learn what they looked like because of that, and therefore the software was unable to recognize them. So this, what I've just explained, and hopefully that was made sense, but is a classic example of algorithmic bias, and where the algorithm was just not trained with enough related data in order to yield an accurate result. So I just want to reiterate, just to answer your question, it's not necessarily about where the data comes from, but like I said, this can present issues too. But in the context of this question, the issue is more about that the data was not good to begin with. So the algorithm has not been trained with enough data to yield an actual correct result. So that was a lot, but I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really love that you put that, Danielle, because in the NAACP, we use a lot of data, particularly when it comes to our civic engagement campaigns, and we're trying to train the community in a statewide election, or in a presidential election, or a midterm election, as we're in this year. And hearing you speak and thinking about the data that we use, and the work that we do, I learned and hear all the time that not all data is good data, and not all data includes Black data. Right? And Black data is a very specific thing, and making sure that that's included, within these artificial intelligences is absolutely important, right? You talk about, the automatic lights. I remember being a young person and walking through certain areas, and lights just automatically turning off me, and I'm waving my hands back and forth, and I'm just like, what's going on? It's not recognizing me, right? I'm a dark-skinned Black man, and I deserve to be seen as well. Right? I have stories, I have experiences that I've been through, and that should also be included.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Well said. And just switching to, I was thinking about hypervisibility as well. So we kind of talked about how folks are being erased on platforms, on social, not being seen by the algorithms, and just not being present in data itself. So I also was thinking about how Black folks experience racism through hypervisibility, so for example, being overrepresented in particular sets of data that, yield harsher consequences or different consequences, like in predictive policing that I had just mentioned. And I was thinking, what other ways does that present itself? So wisdom, I was, thinking we can't talk about AI bias without also talking about systemic inequalities. So what are some ways that you've seen AI bias result in the overrepresentation of Black folks in like harmful systems?
Yeah, so bringing it back again to 2020, where folks are and thinking about even the history of violence in this country. We were told that when there's something wrong happening, the reason why we can't tell the truth about it is because we don't have a video of it. We haven't seen it yet. And so, all the way from Rodney King to, George Floyd, we've been recording these incidents when we interact with the police. When you are pulled over, there's some amazing new app technology that Black designers have been putting out to make sure that they can capture those incidents and situations. And those situations are being shared as viral videos. And I'm glad that folks are capturing that information to be shared so that it can be used in a court of law. But also we have to think about the mental health implications it has on us and our people and young Black people everywhere, right? To be constantly ingesting Black death on a regular basis. We have access more than ever, and we are engaging in social media in so many different ways. But the mental health implications of it is deep, right? I know personally myself, when those things happen, I take a moment to log off of social media, to not engage with that content, because I know how it affects my psyche. And the fact that that is a message that's constantly being put out there as a narrative, particularly for our young Black people, I have to stop and think about, what is good for them, right? Yes, we need that information there. Yes, we want to make sure that the footage is released. Yes, we want to make sure that our police are being held accountable. But we also have to recognize that we need to start valuing Black people and not killing Black people, right? And so we don't have to be taking these videos and putting them out there like that. And so I definitely think that's something that folks have been wrestling with and trying to narrate, because we have a lot of folks who do great mobilization work around these videos, around these social media content, and are able to get victories that change our lives. But we also have to think about how it's affecting us in our day-to-day self.
Yeah, thank you. And similarly, Danielle, how have you seen, AI bias make Black folks or other at-risk communities overrepresented in data that can, perpetuate harmful cycles?
So I hate to keep going back to facial recognition technology, but it's the best example, honestly, to even talk about overrepresentation of data, because within this, we're overrepresented in mugshot data. So this is not anything new. Black Americans are more likely to be arrested and incarcerated for minor crimes than white Americans. It's just a fact. It's nothing to dispute. But because of this, Black people are overrepresented in mugshot data. And what does facial recognition use? Mugshot data. So the Black presence in these systems creates this loop where racist policing strategies lead to a disproportionate arrest of Black people, who are then subjected to further surveillance. So, for example, NYPD, I read, maintains a database of over 42,000 gang affiliates. 99% of them are Black and Latin X. So I guess, no white people are in gangs up there in New York. But there's also no requirements to prove that this person is actually gang affiliated. So they just vibes in the gang affiliated database. No reason for them to be there. Sometimes have no reason to be there at all. And even in certain police departments, they use gang member identification as a productivity measure, meaning that, let's just say, it incentivizes false reporting. So people who are included in these monitoring databases are often subjected to harsher sentencing and higher bails, or a denial of bail altogether, just because they're present there. Like, not because they've done anything, just because they're present there. So when I think about these things, it just is, it's very scary, and it's unfortunate, because these type of harms and what we're talking about doesn't make it to the nightly news, not in the way that we need it to for people to actually understand what's going on. Most of us don't learn about these things until we're wrapped up in a system, or somebody that we know is wrapped up in the system. So this is why this issue is so imperative, and that we are informed on the ways that we're overrepresented in certain types of data, and how these types of data are actually used against us.
Thank you. And that's actually a perfect segue, because we've touched on this, but to reiterate, it's a large data gathering issue as well. And you've been touching on it with facial recognition, and even our behavioral data, as Wisdom was talking about, us pumping the algorithm with sharing information about like police killings, etc. And I've just been thinking about how that data is being collected to then inform decision making by other folks in ways that impact us. And I feel like, because we're using technology so much, I think a lot of us don't quite understand what we're giving away and how it can be used against us. We're in the 21st century. We have to use the internet. We're using technology. So, Danielle, I was wondering if you could speak to how folks can be made more aware of how they're giving away this data in their everyday use on the internet. And what can be done about it.
So give me 1 second.
Yeah.
So basically, this is a big part of like what I talk about with AI policy for Black women. We're dedicated to educating everyday Black Americans on AI, data collection, its uses, and why it matters to the Black community. Because at the end of the day, I think the issue is that if you don't even know a problem exists, you really can't address it. So the first thing that we need to do is get informed on the issues. Our community needs to understand what is AI, like, explaining it in a way that actually resonates with them, that is relatable to our culture, not just something that's just we're just spewing to them, something that they can connect to. Also, in how it's used in your everyday life. You use it more than one ways, in more than one way. You don't just use it for your GPS or your online purchases or the ads on social media and all these great things, right? It's also other things that are affecting Black people that are not necessarily so great. So when we're talking about how can we make people aware that they just need to understand what is happening, like not necessarily, okay, how can we make them aware of their data? Because a lot of this is beyond control. We need a U.S. privacy legislation to address a lot of this. So a starting point for me, I feel, with the Black community needs to be education, first and foremost, on what it is, what's happening, why it's an issue, and why it's a unique issue for Black Americans, and how it perpetuates already existing issues that we have right now.
Thank you. And Wisdom, despite bias issues, this data collection is still normalized, from like research and even advertising. So I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the things that even the NAACP is doing educational wise to inform folks about how these issues are taking place, and what they can, do to mitigate some of this.
Yeah, it really comes down to thinking about how our community is being messaged and marketed in a certain way, being targeted. I think a lot about targeted ads and how those are coming into our community in a very unique way. I remember the first time I realized like Instagram was targeting me. I'm like, oh, why do they get the boot that I was looking for? And I was just talking about going hiking, and then I was just talking about going surfing. I said I was going to go back to California, and all of a sudden I'm seeing all these things that are messaged towards me. I'm like, oh, there's more to this. And so making sure that folks know that as consumers, we have power, right? As consumers, we also control how these brands market towards us, even the look and the feel of who we are as Black people, right? Oftentimes in ads, we'll see photos being retouched and things like that that are setting false standards of beauty. And I really appreciate this conversation, because we actually just finished the NAACP Image Awards, which was a space where we're acknowledging ourselves, acknowledging our stories, and being ourselves in our fullest, best Black excellent self that we can be. And so we have to be able to recognize how we can take back our power, how we can mobilize our members, our volunteers, folks who are activists and organizers across the country to continue fighting for freedom by, using respected brands, recognizing the policies that are in place, and what power you have to change that.
Thank you. That's a great segue. I feel like, Danielle, if you could maybe speak to what ways of collecting data should be banned, or what legislation needs to be put in practice, or I have another follow-up question after that. But yeah, if you could speak to that.
Well, okay, that's a good question, but I would say what should be banned. I don't want to get in on this call and get into a conversation about what should be banned. I do think that what we need is some type of guidance, some type of regulation from the federal government, not from states, because right now we have a complete we have a patchwork of these privacy laws, which causes problems not only for the companies and how they actually run their companies, but also for us and keeping up with what rights or access or what we can and cannot access from the data that they collected from us. There needs to be so much more of a broader conversation regarding the banning of data. But I will say is regarding one bill that's in Congress, I believe is by Congressman Wyden. The Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which is basically a ban on selling data to law enforcement agencies as a way, or collecting data to then develop products to then market to law enforcement agencies. So I think that would be a good starting point outside of federal legislation. But yeah, I think at a bare minimum, our information that we're giving away kind of essentially freely on these platforms should not then be collected and sold to government bodies that have traditionally been at odds with the Black community. So I think we need to start there, but also just think about how it would fit into a larger discussion around what would we like to see as Black people in a federal privacy legislation.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, the starting point would be guidelines. So I was wondering if you have seen, guidelines or this kind of conversation, maybe even outside of the US, that seemed effective and could serve as a model of what's possible.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's something that we do grapple with in DC and on the Hill. But like I just said, there's no federal privacy law. But when we think about what California has done, it seems like their privacy law has the most teeth and is most comparable to what they are currently doing in the EU with their GDPR, which is essentially, it just gives consumers a way to access, delete, or get information that was collected on them. California seems to be the strongest in the nation since they have a private right of action, meaning that people will have the ability to sue a company due to negligence regarding a data breach. But as far as, I would say the closest thing that I would think that the U.S. would probably go after would be a GDPR. So that it would probably be that. But right now, everything is so honestly a mess and just not cohesive that, like I said, we need a real moment or to think and really understand what's at stake if we don't get a federal privacy legislation within the next few years.
Thank you. And before we get into Q&A, because there's a couple of questions coming in, just to, we've talked a bit about this, but for folks like, me or somebody else who's listening, what can, they start, stop, or continue doing to take back control of their data? I believe, Wisdom, you kind of touched on this a bit earlier as well. But yeah.
Yeah, from the NAACP, what we've been working on really is about corporate accountability, right? These corporations and these organizations that are buying and selling our data, ensuring that there is a permanent civil rights infrastructure at the C-suite level, right? That it's not just a consulting or, hey, every time we get in trouble, let's bring somebody in to help us get out of trouble. It's a reimagining of what these organizations and the way data is collected. I think Danielle kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's not just zeros and ones, right? There's somebody who is deciding what goes in and what goes out. And so ensuring that those people are people who come from our community, people who have the experiences, people who understand the policies necessary to help our community progress and are actively going to do that and are accountable to people who will follow through every single time.
Thank you. And Danielle, if you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Wisdom kind of hit the nail on the head there, but essentially I'll just say, understand what's at stake, be informed. I would say get familiar with your privacy settings, understand the privacy policies, learn how to make them work for you. Read those privacy policies because you'll be surprised at the things you're agreeing to. Advocate, put pressure on your congressional people, pressure on your local elected officials to address these issues. Like, they're there for you, and this is a part of the things that affect our community specifically in a way that's unlike anybody else. Nobody has the same outcomes when we're talking about algorithmic bias as the black community, and specifically darker skinned Black women. Black people are the trendsetters, like the creators of cool. We make a lot of these tech companies profitable. No other group, and I hope I'm not out of line when I say it, has a social media presence such as Black Twitter. Like, we make things, So I'm joking, but I'm saying this in a way that we are a big part of why these companies exist and are profitable. So it should be the bare minimum for us to not only hold ourselves accountable, but hold these companies accountable to the things that are occurring on their platform and how they're affecting our community.
Thank you. Okay, I have one last question before we get into Q&A. So we've talked a lot about how, algorithmic bias is harming Black folks and what can be done to mitigate this. I'm a bit of an idealist, so I also wanted to take, a bit of space to reimagine what's possible. So what could it look like for, artificial intelligence and machine learning systems benefit Black communities and meet our needs? What could this look like? Wisdom, if you could take it first.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm a big fan of Afrofuturism and making sure that we are re-envisioning a world, one, where Black people are in it, but two, where we're in a world that the issues that currently exist that keep our community from accessing certain spaces or being able to progress forward no longer exists. And so when we think about, the future of AI, right, I'm thinking about, I love Black techies. I love Black data folks. I love Black folks who understand this to a deeper degree and are also willing to create new platforms that we can elevate the work that we're doing, right? A lot of the things that we do at the NAACP is partnering with, and you put it right, Danielle, in terms of like, we are the culture, right? Partnering with social media platforms that are pushing amazing stories and content, right? You look at the Watch the Yard, you look at the deep connections to HBCU culture, right? All that stuff is deep in these social platforms and deeply ingrained into the AI. And I would love to see more Black folks in those spaces, inventing and creating their own spaces where we can conversate, talk, kiki, chat, and be our beautiful Black selves.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle.
I completely agree. I like to imagine what a smart city would look like that would be tailored to the needs of the Black community. Like, that would be so cool to me. Like, because at the end of the day, we're not represented right now in tech at any level, especially when we're talking about the development of this technology. But just imagine how it would look if we were at the table in these tech companies. We were helping to write the algorithms, and how this could help mitigate the biases that we see in tech. This could help mitigate the biases we see in facial recognition technology, predictive risk algorithms, lending, housing, education, social media, healthcare algorithms, which are becoming increasingly problematic for Black people. So imagine what this could also do for our social justice movements and voting right efforts and upward mobility in society. I mean, artificial intelligence can be used for good, but only if we understand, how, and we must be informed about it. We have to be open to learning, not only learning, but also advocating and just making sure we hold ourselves accountable for learning and also holding the tech companies accountable for the harms that occur on their platforms.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and so I'm just going to open it up for audience Q&A. So this one we kind of touched on a bit, but from the audience, since poor and skewed data can be a cause of AI bias, how do we ensure top quality data for training that AI?
Yeah, we kind of touched on this.
Yeah.
For me, in my opinion, is that we need more people like us developing the technology. Like, that's honestly the only way it's going to be. You can't, because when we look at it, the people who are building the technologies now, it works good for them. It's 85% accurate for white males. That's great for them. Imagine if we were there building too, we would probably have an accuracy rate that high as well. So that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, so many of these algorithmic biases can be so unseen. What are some strategies that you have engaged in to lift the veil for our communities to see these uses of technologies in our everyday lives? I think we kind of touched on this a bit, but Wisdom, if you could.
Yeah. So, for me, my work touches multiple different areas, campaigns, policy, but I also like to stay up to date in what's happening. And I just like to follow folks who are deeply ingrained in Black technology, Black algorithms. Idris Sandu, amazing young person doing great things, worked with Nipsey Hussle to create, an amazing virtual store. And that's what, this future looks like. Like, paying attention to those things are going to be helpful because these are the people who are helping us push it forward by combining AI with culture, right? Recognizing that if we are the culture, we have to make sure that's included in there early on, not just added afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you. And then this is the last question. Someone would like to ask you if you could address how you feel about how we're being listened to as well. For example, I'll have a call with someone, not search for what that topic is, and then go to Instagram and see ads for what we're just talking about. They said, that's scary. So how you all feel about this level of surveillance that's happening, and yeah.
Well, according to the companies, no one's listening to you. It's just, that they're good at predicting what you like and want, which part of that I agree with. They are very good at predicting what your internet gets to know you very well. Like, it knows you better than you know yourself. It knows what you probably gonna buy tomorrow from like, it's a great tool, but I would just say we need more transparency around these algorithms and what's actually going into them. Like, there's no other way to address these concerns without addressing that. And I don't know the best way to do that, but I will say that I don't see us going forward without it.
Yeah, I think there's so much. When you just think about your day to day, right? I wake up at 8 a.m. I check my email. I read the news. I send some emails, do some work, log onto Instagram. Send a Snapchat to a friend. Go on Twitter. There's so many areas that I am engaging, and data is being collected about us. And I really believe that we have digital profiles and digital imprints, right? People pulled Wisdom Cole in 200, right? They would say, hey, this is what Wisdom did back in the 2020s. But I don't think that picture is 100% accurate. And I think that's our goal. How do they get them to see the full us, right? There's a part of our profile, our pictures within this data that people are missing because they're not including us in those conversations, and we're not being coded into the AIs.
Thank you. Yeah, and so that is pretty much the end of it. I will say there was a lot of engagement in the comments throughout the chat. Folks are really resonating with what you all have said today. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you all for joining us. And, I feel like we've touched on a lot of things, but if there are any final thoughts that you would want to leave the audience with, this just asking if there are any final thoughts or steps or actions that you would want to impart on folks.
Well, I'm just going to continue to drive home the point of becoming educated on these issues. I just have a new nonprofit, AI Policy for Black Women. You can visit at AIP4blackwomen.org. You can join our newsletter to keep informed on all of the developments that are happening in this area, and also just a chance to network and get to know like-minded women and other men, and just let's start figuring out how we can make this better for our communities, because tech isn't going anywhere. We got the metaverse coming, and we need to be trying to address these issues so we can address the next set of issues for the metaverse.
Yeah, no, it's deep, and I think we need each and every one of you to get involved and to participate. Something that we say at the NAACP is that membership is power, right? And being a part of an organization or an entity or joining a group where you can continue to advocate and make sure that our stories and everything about our culture is being heard in the appropriate way that is necessary is key. And so I really encourage folks to join. If you're not a member of the NAACP, definitely go to naacp.org to join. You can find the local branch, chapter, unit. We're all across the nation, and even expanding past that too. And so recognizing that our stories are integral to our future, are integral to the policies that are put in place. And without us, it's not inclusive.
Without us, it is not inclusive. Great way to wrap that up. Thank you so much, Danielle and Wisdom, for joining me today. And also, I want to say thank you to the NAACP for your partnership. This was the last event for the Unpacked series. So I also just want to thank all of the panelists who have participated in the past 2 events as well. And thank you for everyone who watched. I personally learned a lot. I have a lot of things that I'm going to take into my practice and what I'm trying to do, and the advocacy work that I hope to do. And yeah, thank you all for joining. That's really it. Thank you all for joining so much.
Thank you for having me.
It was great meeting you, Danielle.
Nice meeting you too, Wisdom.